June 10th, 1977 marked the launch of the original Apple II microcomputer, released as a follow-up to the Apple I, primarily designed by engineering genius Steve Wozniak. The computer was a landmark in both design and function, as it not only looked noticeably slicker than many of the other home computers at the time, but it had color graphics, a built-in keyboard, and a huge potential for expansion with its 8 expansion slots. 40,000 units of this first model were sold, and Apple continued to build on its success with subsequent updates to the 8-bit machine, like the II Plus, the IIe, and the IIc. Apple released several other machines alongside these, like the Lisa, and even an intended successor called the Apple III, but for various reasons, these never gained much of a foothold, and the Apple II remained Apple's cash cow for years. However, by the mid-80s, the Apple II faithful longed for an update to their computer, since the machine had tons of software and it was still very useful, though it was quickly losing ground to newer computers like the Amiga and the Atari ST. But in 1984, Apple had released the Macintosh, and while it wasn't initially very successful, the company continued pushing the Mac as the company's future. As such, the Apple II line was receiving less and less attention from Apple, and when the next-gen Apple II was finally released in 1986, called the IIGS, it never got the corporate fanfare it deserved. While the IIGS sold very well in its first year and was a proper reimagining of the Apple II, featuring backwards compatibility and updated graphics and sound as implied by the name GS, the computer was nonetheless still an Apple II. It held on to the past while hinting at the future, and was a bit of an oddity in that respect. Still, the IIGS was quite capable, and held out until 1992 when it was totally eclipsed by the Macintosh and discontinued. There are a few main variants of the IIGS to look out for, starting with the first 10,000 machines manufactured, known as Woz editions. The only thing setting this apart from the regular IIGS is a silkscreen signature of Steve Wozniak on the front of the case. Which brings me to the most common machine, the stock GS. Same thing as the Woz edition, just without a signature, and this is the one you're most likely to run across when searching for one, though it may have any number of expansions installed increasing its value. Another version is the IIGS Upgrade, which was a kit made available to owners of the older IIe. With this, your 8-bit Apple IIe could be retrofitted with a 16-bit Apple IIGS motherboard. Although it wasn't very popular due to the fact that it didn't save much money, it didn't come with a mouse, and some of the newer expansion boards didn't fit the slanted IIe case. I got my Apple IIGS for the cost of shipping, thanks to the incredible generosity of YouTuber Dave99. Thank you once again, Sir of Sirs. However, you can expect to pay anywhere from $50 to $200 or so, depending on what the computer comes with, as the stock IIGS itself isn't too costly, but the peripherals and add-ons certainly can be. Just looking at the outside of the IIGS, you'll notice that it's more boxy and predictable than the older Apple IIs, although that's not intrinsically a bad thing. In fact, it has lines reminiscent of the Apple IIc released in 1984, and I like the look and feel of that, so the IIGS isn't terrible or anything, but I still prefer the classic lines of the II, II Plus, and IIe. Same goes for the keyboard, which is again more similar to the IIcs than, say, the IIes. It feels good enough to type on, I suppose, but the keys don't travel very far, and unfortunately it seems a tad brittle, as mine was busted up a bit during shipment due to being delivered by rabid gorillas, and the original IIGS keyboard isn't easy to replace for a decent price. Fortunately, the IIGS uses ADB, the Apple Desktop Bus, so you can use compatible peripherals with no problem. It was actually the first Apple computer to use ADB, predating the Macintosh getting it by about half a year. So yes, you can also use any ADB mouse with it, although the mouse that it comes with is nice enough. It's often called the trapezoid mouse, which was also included with Macintoshes for years after the GS introduced it. It's an improvement over Apple's serial mouse, but it kind of feels like you're fondling a block of cheese. On the back, you've got a bunch of integrated ports, which is a nice change from the more bare-bones configurations of Apple II's past. You've got headphone or speaker output, serial ports for both a modem and printer, a joystick port, an external floppy drive port, RGB video output for monitors, NTSC composite video output, ADB keyboard input, and a power plug-in switch. You may see more ports up above depending on what add-on cards you have installed, or if you've been hit particularly hard in the head recently, but this is just the basic configuration. As with the earlier Apple IIs, opening it up and gaining access to its insides is pleasurably simple. While the GS is pretty darned capable on its own, chances are you'll want to expand the machine. You were supplied with 7 expansion ports and 1 memory expansion port, and this is plenty considering all that's built into the motherboard already. You've got at least 128K of standard RAM, 128K of fast RAM, as well as 64K of dedicated sound RAM. In fact, it has an Ensoniq 5503 digital oscillator chip for wavetable music and sound, providing 8-bit audio with 32 oscillator channels resulting in 8 independent stereo channels. Pretty impressive stuff. It was actually designed by Robert Yanis, who also designed the legendary SID chip in the Commodore 64, and is the same chip used in keyboards like the Ensoniq Mirage and ESQ1. For the display, you have a custom video graphics chip, providing compatibility for all the old Apple II graphics modes, as well as new 320x200 to 640x200 resolution modes using a 12-bit palette for a total of 4,096 possible colors, usually showing 16 at once from multiple palettes. And running the whole show is a 128K system ROM with a WDC65C816 CPU running at 2.8 MHz, allowing for an 8-bit data bus and a 16-bit address bus. There were 3 main revisions to the 2GS through the years, so newer machines may have more pre-installed RAM and a larger, more optimized ROM. Of course, all of this can be expanded upon no matter what the version, and my machine came with several additions. The first is an Apple Memory Expansion Board, which increases the amount of random access memory to allow for more complex software and multitasking. Super handy stuff. I also got an Inner Drive hard drive kit, which allows for installation of IDE hard drives. It not only comes with a controller board, but an entire new PSU in order to provide the extra power the hard drive requires. There are also more modern options for installing compact flash cards and such, and I'd probably recommend those instead. Also highly recommended is an accelerator board, like this Transwarp GS by Applied Engineering. This provides an expandable cache and faster CPU clock speeds, allowing the 2GS to seriously fly at anywhere from 7 to even 18 MHz. Now this is important because some 2GS software can run pretty friggin' slow on a stock machine, so a board like this or the Zip GS is incredibly useful, although they're not cheap. And while these things are optional, there are a couple things you'll need in order to do much of anything with it, starting with a monitor. I have here the original 2GS color RGB monitor, and unless you're going with a composite display of some kind, you don't have a ton of other options. It's not compatible with RGB Macintosh monitors, since it needs one that can horizontally sync to 15.75 kHz, so keep that in mind. Another thing you'll probably want is a floppy drive or two, as Apple 2GS software came on 800K 3.5-inch floppies, and if you want to play older Apple II software, then you'll want a compatible 140K 5.25-inch floppy drive. And if you're into playing games, you'll likely want a joystick of some kind. Any old Apple II joysticks or paddles should work just fine. Now as for software, well, running Apple II stuff is pretty much the same as it was on older systems. Start up the machine, insert a ProDOS disk or whatever, and run the proper command for the proper drive and slot. It gets a bit more involved when you begin messing with GSOS, the graphical user interface for the 2GS. It's actually pretty similar to the Macintosh OS of the time, although in some ways it's actually better. It's in color for one, and makes efficient use of file system translators, allowing it to support multiple on-disk file systems transparently to applications, letting you read things like ProDOS and Macintosh HFS disks. Of course, you'll need at least 1.25 megs of RAM and preferably a faster than stock CPU to use GSOS, but still, if you can, it's awesome. As mentioned before, older Apple II games work just fine on the 2GS, though you may have to slow down the CPU to get proper speeds, but there isn't nearly as much 2GS specific software out there. I think there's less than 150 retail games and a bunch of shareware, but there is still some seriously great stuff if you look for it, and here are a few of my favorites. Like I said, there isn't a ton of 2GS software, and what there is isn't super easy to come by, at least in its original form. If you don't have a flash memory solution installed, one way to get software is to write it to a blank disk using another system. You can either try to write Apple 2GS software on an older Macintosh with a 3.5-inch floppy drive, or connect the 2GS to a more modern computer and just use a null modem serial cable connection to transfer it using a program like ADT Pro. It's kinda clunky and it's slow, but it works. Of course, the emulation option is always there too if that's your thing, and I'd recommend Kegs if you're wanting to emulate the 2GS. Though if you just want to emulate the regular Apple II, then something like Applewin will suffice. So, is the Apple II GS worth buying or not? I would say absolutely yes. Possibly, maybe, depending on what you're looking for. That's often what it comes down to with these kinds of machines, because while it is awesome and pretty underrated, it can also be pretty expensive to get a machine that's worthwhile messing around with, because I can't understate the importance of one of those accelerator cards like the Transwarp or the Zip. So, yeah, then those things can be really costly. Thankfully, I got a good deal. I mean, you can't beat the cost of shipping for this one, so that's why I got it. I always wanted one, but, you know, the cost is sort of a barrier in that respect, even though, yeah, the machine is awesome. I mean, in some ways, it even surpasses the Amiga and the Atari ST, and of course, those systems have a ton more games. That's kind of beside the point, but what this does have is fantastic, is what I'm trying to say. So, it's in the same league as those other great 16-bit systems of the 80s, and I think that's awesome. It's just a shame it didn't sell many units and didn't get a ton of software. So for, you know, it's got those ups and downs that if you're a hardcore collector, you like these 80s machines, definitely give the 2GS a look. Otherwise, you might want to look towards like the Amiga or the ST simply because it has more software and it's more affordable.